Welcome and thank you for joining this second of 3 roundtable discussions. I'm Hannah Farrar, Chief Executive of CF, a management consulting and analytics company dedicated to improving health and healthcare. I'm co-chairing these discussions with Sir Chris Ham. Chris is currently independent chair of the Coventry and Warwickshire STP, a non-executive director of the Royal Free London NHS Foundation Trust, a board advisor to me at CF, and he's also co-chair of the new NHS Assembly. Chris kind of needs no introduction. I'm sure you know him from the years of service he's put into the sector. So I hope you have a cup of tea handy, whether you're watching the recording or here in person. And over the next hour, you can take the opportunity to sit back and enjoy the discussion that we have in store. If you're watching us live, I suggest you use the speaker view so that you can focus on our panelists today, who I'm going to leave Chris to introduce in a moment or two, and leave yourself on mute. But it's an opportunity to reflect, and I hope it provides some reassurances of the approaches that you're currently taking yourselves, but perhaps also some new ideas as well. So the plan is that I'm going to provide a short overview of the roundtable series, and then Chris is going to get us started on today's conversation by introducing the panelists and starting us off with some questions. We will then, after Chris and I have approached everyone with our questions, going to open them up to those of you who are with us live. So use the chat function and let us and the panelists know the questions that you want them to discuss. So why this roundtable series? Well, COVID-19 has introduced unprecedented challenges to the health and care sector, unlike anything most of us have seen before. And during this time of crisis and uncertainty, leaders have remained focused on their mission and adapted to the changes and experiences that are before them. Rather than bracing for temporary hardship before a return to normal, we all know this is indeed a marathon and not a sprint. Leaders are preparing for a permanent shift in how to plan, prioritize, and deliver services. So to equip colleagues across the sector with relevant and timely insights and a robust forum for discussion, we're hosting this 3-part roundtable series, and it features prominent panelists who are leaders in the health and care system themselves. We want these roundtables to tackle specific ways that leaders and organisations have to respond to, manage, and now anticipate the need for further change. As I said, is an opportunity for reflection and shared learning. So that's enough from me. I'm going to pass to Chris to get us started on today's topic and today's discussion. Thanks, Chris.
Well, thanks very much, Hannah. I'm pleased to be involved. Looking forward to our roundtable. It's my privilege to introduce our stellar panel this morning. I have lengthy CVs for each, but in the interest of time, I'm going to do very brief introductions. First, we have Donna Hall, who is the chair of Bolton NHS Foundation Trust, but also very well known for the work that she and colleagues did in Wigan Council and building the approach around community engagement with very beneficial results. Jo Sauvage, a colleague in North London, based on the work I'm doing in the Royal Free, GP leader, involved in clinical work, but increasingly now involved across the whole of North Central London in the plans for an integrated care system. Jackie Daniel, Chief Executive of Newcastle upon Tyne Foundation Trust, with again lengthy career in the NHS in different roles, and now working with colleagues in Newcastle around partnership to improve health outcomes for the population. Last but not least, Fiona Edwards, who's a Trust Chief Executive and the Integrated Care System Lead for the Frimley Integrated Care System. So we're going to hear from all 4 of our panelists during the course of our roundtable over the next hour or so. And with this focus, as Hannah's explained, on what's the role of places within integrated care system, particularly around partnership working, not just within the NHS, but across the NHS, local government, community sector, and so on. around tackling inequalities in health, working on the wider determinants of health and well-being, but joining up care around populations and thinking about particularly voluntary and community sector engagement, which is a critical part of what Donna was involved in her work in Wigan and still involved in Bolton, and through her role as chair of what we're now calling New Local, Donna, which you might want to explain. So why don't we move straight into the panel discussion? And Donna, I am going to start with you, really to draw on your experience about ways of leveraging community assets to work with the NHS, local government and other partners. What's the best way of doing that? What's your advice from your experience in different roles?
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Chris. And it's so good that Farrar are doing this session on place. I'm made up because it's so important. And I think it's gaining traction. We've seen during the pandemic the importance of building up from what we already have existing in place. We've seen the expertise in public health that, in my personal opinion, could have been used better for track and trace, and our NHS labs. So, you know, we've seen this dichotomy and tension and friction between centralisation and local working. So, but back to your question, Chris, around community assets. I don't know if people have read this. I feel like a book salesperson, but I don't know if you've read this really good book by Nigel Crisp about hospitals are for repair, home is for maintenance. And it really, oh, there you go. You got a copy as well. But it's so good. And it advises us to take off our NHS spectacles before we start to think about a different relationship with our communities, because we have been kind of trained, haven't we, over the years to manage our organisations, to focus on KPIs, to focus on specific KPIs more than others. So, you know, delayed transfers of care, 4-hour waits, you know, and we've become kind of obsessed with those targets. But the trouble is, and I'm sure we all know this, is that people can fall between the cracks of those targets, and we're not thinking about the person, the community, the neighbourhood, the street, and the reality of how people really live their lives. So we tried to build on the fantastic assets that we had in Wigan as part of the Wigan deal, and they were our 323,000 people who lived in Wigan Borough. We had 160 million to save. That's just the council, not the NHS. Huge savings, and we knew we couldn't just salami slice and make cutbacks. We had to redefine the role of public services, working together in the place, and really focus on prevention and shift all of the money that we had, available money that we had, into transformation and prevention, and things like risk stratification, but investing in community solutions that really made a difference and could get to the parts of the community that we couldn't as clunky municipal public services. I do think it needs a different type of leadership, and I'm sure people that will resonate with people are on the call. Much more of a focus on listening to communities, much more of a focus on listening to each other, less heroic leadership, much more humility. You don't win every single battle that you enter, but it also takes a lot of courage and courageous investment into things that you might think, well, I'm not going to necessarily see the benefit of that. So an example of that is in Bolton. Bolton at Home, who are a registered social landlord, invest 3 million a year in community projects, in preventative projects that are around mental health support, physical activity, addressing social isolation and loneliness. And the council do the same. They match that funding. We put 13 million in Wigan into the community to support prevention. And that was key to our transformation. So I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. So, Joe, if I come to you, I mean, the COVID pandemic has surely underlined everything that Donna's said. What's your experience in general practice?
So I think it's really interesting. I think that, so in general practice now, you know, we have absolutely changed overnight in terms of the way we're delivering care. And that's been really in response to COVID. So very much the construct of digital by default, virtual consultation, etc. So it's very much around how we provide, you know, the old tenets of access, proactive and, you know, coordinated care, working within, you know, a multidisciplinary team. But, you know, it is important to remember that as we approach general practice in that way, you know, GPs are very much embedded within local communities and have ever been thus. And, you know, as a GP, I feel it's really important to say that, you know, that longitudinal care, that continuity of care, that understanding around the community, you know, the community asset, the problems that exist within a community are really very important as we go forward. And, you know, if we focus very much on remote consulting and total triage, etc., we are potentially in danger of losing the very essence which comes from, you know, continuity, the interpersonal relationship, the empathy, the understanding of the person, the context of their family and their community. So I feel very, very strongly about that. Now, I think in terms of the role of the general practitioner, the role of general practice within place is about really beginning to give voice to that in the way we work with our residents and our patients to develop services in a very different way. And more importantly, how we use that bottom-up opportunity to inform up into our systems, into our integrated systems, so that as we embrace the construct of strategic commissioning going forward, we can actually make sure that we are really delivering what needs to be done. And that that is done in partnership, not just considering the health paradigm, but very much in partnership with voluntary sector partners, local authority partners. So our focus is very much on, you know, the wider determinants, which we know are the barriers to long-term well-being and health.
Thanks, Jo. And Jackie, you lead a very large specialist teaching hospital with researchers doing world-class work. How does that fit into the community in the Northeast?
Thanks, Chris. Well, it almost certainly does, because although we do provide those really high-end, you know, very specialised services, we also provide community services in place. So I think, yeah, we've been really embracing our responsibility, if you like, as an anchor organisation. And the way that, you know, if ever I needed to kind of sell this to the 16,000 staff we have, it goes like this. It's kind of, you know, we are doubly outstanding. You know, I think the only trust of our size that's been rated like that, the CQC. We've got some glittering assets, but we've got some of the worst health inequalities in the country and possibly, you know, across Europe and the world. So we've got a deep-seated responsibility to shift some of that. And I think, you know, creating, I call sticky edges, but new relationships with our fantastic universities in the city, but also with a very capable local authority. And as part of a combined authority, you know, our reach and our ability to connect through integrated services, for example, you know, joining up mental health, social care, community teams within hospital services as well. Creating a different narrative around why we're doing what we're doing. You know, thinking about changing some of the behaviours and values between partnerships. I think Donna mentioned that earlier about, you know, it is a responsibility to act together like never before, I think, because of some of the challenges that we face that I think have just been made even deeper through COVID. And I'll just give you a little COVID example. So we've just taken on responsibility to develop an integrated COVID lab to be able to mass test the whole of the population in the north of England, which we've done because we can. But in doing that, we're creating probably close to 4,000 new jobs. And the way that we want to try and reach out to the employment of those jobs is by really thinking about the communities and postcodes in which we're going to try and offer opportunities. And that can be a game changer in terms of health, wealth and well-being. And I sort of deliberately step through those, you know, those zones, because they're all, as we know, so deeply connected. So if we've not got a prospering economic environment, then, you know, health and well-being almost certainly is suffering. So I can give you lots of examples, but hopefully that gets us started, Chris.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jackie. Fiona, let me come to you. Frimley's made up of lots of different places, I know. How's it going there for you?
Yeah, so Yes, it is. We've got 5 places defined, 4 of which are coterminous with 3 small unitaries and 1 borough, and 1 of which spans both a first-tier authority and 2 local districts. And so our and therein lies part of the challenge around the definition of place, I think, for health. And I come at the place really, and really from a position, I was really interested in what Donna said about learning to lead in a very different way. That for me, an integrated care system is about really achieving the best blend of competencies and capabilities, and that really we understand ourselves. So I actually come at it from quite a personal angle in that I'm a resident in one of the places, the richest unitary borough, the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, which is bang next door to one of the most deprived boroughs in Slough. And we saw through COVID the disproportionate impact of COVID on the population, 54% of which in Slough are from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background. But what we also achieved was a place-led response to COVID in Slough, with the development of looking at taking an asset-based approach, really working with communities as to what works for them. And it's not health that knows how to do that. It's our local authority partners that really know about community mobilisation, know how to use traffic wardens to cut congregations around takeaways, for example, which was a core cause of outbreak in Slough and continuation of outbreak, actually going down to the level of understanding this neighbourhood and street as Donna described. So for me, where we're at is really understanding that leadership isn't about a hierarchical, triangular approach in our integrated care system. It's about allowing and supporting leadership of where the capability sits in place to take charge of the wider determinants of health and really challenging health inequalities in partnership with our GPs, and then health and hospital provision. And I run a mental health and learning disability organisation, providing our expertise in, but also orientating our response blend of knowledge and sharing of expertise. So that's where I'm at with Place, and Frimley has a strategy that we frame as absolutely tackling health inequalities. Our overall objective over the next 5 years is to improve the quality of life expectancy for children and the by about of a high quality life expectancy by 2 years, and to reduce the gap between the most deprived and the most affluent in terms of life expectancy by 3 years. And just to end on the note that, as I say, we have we kind of a microcosm of England in that we have the longest lived population in Surrey Heath, in Frimley Town, and then we have some of the most challenged deprivation issues in Slough and in Aldershot, and the gap is huge, and Place is the driver for really addressing those inequalities, supported by health expertise.
Thank you, Fiona. And listening to you reminds me of what I think David Nicholson once said: the NHS needs to look out more instead of always looking up to the demands being thrown at you from the centre and from the regions. So you've given us some good examples of that. Hannah, can I pass over to you?
Thanks, Chris. I don't know what you think, but I feel like we've got so much to explore in those kind of opening remarks from everybody. I would say those of you listening to this live, though, if you have a question you want Chris and I to explore with colleagues, please do put it in the chat. But as Chris has given me the floor, I'm going to get my go. And Jo, I'd quite like to come back and ask you some questions, at least to start with, on PCNs. specifically, maybe more than general practice, obviously developing, emerging, evolving PCNs across the country. And you talked about the importance of general practice in place. Clearly, PCNs are a health vehicle for backbone in place. It'd be good to get your perspective looking forward on how you think they need to grow and develop to make this kind of a success, and what do you think some of the key challenges are in getting there?
Thank you, Hannah. So I think, yes, I think the PCN is a fantastic vehicle really to tackle some of the historical problems that we've had in primary care, particularly working collaboratively, particularly managing unwarranted variation, particularly being able to work better at scale to tackle some of the problems around resilience, but also really how we can use data far more intelligently and estate and workforce in a much more intelligent and productive way to actually deliver services to that set number of people, of residents that are registered, which is at 30 to 50,000, varying depending on where you are. So I think that looking across the country, the state of maturity of the primary care networks is different. But certainly what we have seen is some fantastic grassroots clinical leadership coming to the fore, really being able to provide some of that local leadership. Now, in terms of the opportunity, it suddenly enables a collective group of clinicians, but not just clinicians, thinking really about a much wider team of people focusing on that particular population. So really tackling some of those issues that we've had for so long, the hard nut of integration and person-centered care and actually being able to provide care around an individual in the context of the place where they live. So really being able to work in a much more, I suppose, in a broad multidisciplinary way, but really to use data in a much more intelligent way to really understand the needs of the population. Now, when you look at a borough, you can drill down that the needs of a population can be very variable and very local. And I think it's, the ability to be able to look at that data, to look at that population in a much more sort of forensic way enables you to work in place with a bigger partnership and the residents to actually think about the interventions that are more valuable. And that will vary very much depending on the group of people that you're supporting. So, for example, many of us will have seen the impact of COVID, how it's had a very differential impact on some of our Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. Now, in a way that we'd never really anticipated or even thought about, because actually we weren't scrutinizing the data in that way. So I think many of us are now looking at a much more, and I noticed that, the book Health is Made at Home, but a much more barefoot doctoring way of doing things. So really understanding the needs of the population and developing far more bespoke interventions which don't sit within a prescription pad or a doctor's surgery, but are much more sort of community-based and based around well-being, which actually produce much better outcomes and enable us to reach the parts that hitherto we've not been able to reach.
Thanks, Jo. I guess, Donna, I was wondering on your take on it from your experience in Wigan. Can you give us any real examples of the importance and prominence of primary care and the role that it needed to play in the transformation that you delivered there?
Yeah, I was nodding my head off then when Jo was speaking, because I too don't like the prescription pad and social prescription. I think that is the wrong terminology as well. It's not about, that the GP knows what's best for you, but it is about GPs, it's about colleagues in adult social care, in children's social care. It's about reablement teams, connecting people into their assets and thinking differently about building the social scaffolding that we don't often have in our communities. It's been eroded over the years. Local government funding's been cut hugely, literally cut in half over the last 10 years. Not a political comment, just a factual comment. So basically a lot of funding to community and voluntary groups has been scaled back. And I think we need to think as health and care leaders about investing more in that social scaffolding. So a practical example is a community centre that we had in Wigan called Sunshine House. It was an adult day centre where we used to ship people from all across the borough of Wigan, which is the 9th largest in the UK, on a council minibus, bring them in every day, sit them down, sit them next to people they didn't know. Sometimes they didn't like them, with the same plate of bourbon creams, and you know, they would ship them back, and that package of care costs about £3,000 to £5,000 a week. So what we did in the end was we closed that day centre. We found it wasn't effective and people weren't happy, and the feedback we got was awful. So we invested in what people did want in the local community, which was a kind of luncheon club, it was a bingo club, it was a rugby memories group, which was, you know, because Wigan's a big rugby town. So thinking about what are the kind of, not just the needs, but what do people like doing, what do they enjoy doing, what keeps them mentally, you know, with it, and what keeps them physically connected and socially connected to neighbours and friends. And we put all of our money in that. We worked really intensively with Wigan Warriors, with local businesses, with local community and voluntary groups, and created a kind of support package which wasn't a prescription, it was what people really wanted and needed. So that's, and going back to Fiona's comment about the objective being an improvement in healthy life expectancy, that was ours as well. And over a 10-year period, Chris knows this because he did a brilliant piece of evaluation with the King's Fund on the success of the Wigan deal, was we managed to increase healthy life expectancy in the most deprived areas by 7 years. You know, that's, if you stick with this, it works. It's not just a kind of hippie fancy fad, it works.
Thanks, Donna. Don't go, keep the floor, because there's a question in the chat from Nick, which I think it's also helpful to get maybe Joe's reflections on as well. But kind of the things that you and her have just been talking about, it says, how important is it to local government and primary care and NHS organisations to open up the data their organisations hold to place-based community organisations? I guess I'm interested to know how much you did that in Wigan, and how much was held back. You know, how fundamental do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's really, really fundamental. And as Joe said, it's important that public servants work together on that data sharing. Some of it is hard data, so you can do risk stratification together, but some of it's the softer intelligence that community organisations might be able to help with. So we would have case conferences every day between adult social care, children's social care, GPs, schools were a key part of it, community and voluntary organisations, veterans support groups, mental health charities, and we came up with a plan of action for every single person who'd come up through that risk stratification process. We had something almost 3,000 people who were at risk of an unplanned hospital admission, and we got that from working with our CCG intensively to get that data. So we proactively went through our GPs to wrap a support package of care and community activity around each of those individuals who were on that list. And we saw a 30% reduction in unplanned hospital admissions in that year by using risk stratification intelligently on a place base and working across partnerships.
Thanks. Thanks, Donna. Jack, it'd be great to get your reflections on this data question that's being asked by Nick, and how important you think it is to share the data. I mean, that he uses the free schools example, also GP data. Be good to get your reflections.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you know, in common, you know, with what Joe and Donna said, we've worked at different levels to kind of completely join up through, you know, social care, mental health, primary care, community teams, you know, and I suspect that model's pretty common in most places in terms of, you know, neighbourhoods, if you like. But we've also worked hard at connecting all of that technology. I mean, I think it's about different people will have different assets. So in Newcastle, we've got a national innovation centre for data. And it's obviously a university asset, but we've really leveraged that kind of thing into this. So we've created horrible language, but a kind of command centre, if you like. So we've got fantastic data flows across all of our hospital, care, residential beds. I mean, we're blessed with, you know, a lot of technological infrastructure, but, you know, during COVID, we could even put some of the technology into care homes to know when some of those residents were going to start, if you like, deteriorating. And, you know, we've got integrated teams who are looking at that information all of the time. But we've also got a thing called the Great North Care Record, where we've integrated the record right through from general practice, social care, you know, hospital care, mental health, across the whole of North East and, you know, North Cumbria. It's leveraging that kind of capability, I think, for the benefit of all. And, you know, breaking through some of the ridiculous bureaucracy that often gets in the way of doing that. But I think to design a system that can really think with the right kind of data, and sometimes it feels like it's just throwing up more questions. But of course, if you can work collectively on what is this telling us, how do we use it, it's so powerful.
Thanks, Jackie. Fiona, maybe last word from you on the data and analytics question. I know it's part of the Frimley source, data and analytics. I guess I'm interested to know what you think some of the barriers are that you would ideally like to see sort of put aside to reduce some of the bureaucracy that Jackie was describing. What would make it easier to give this data and insight into the hands of all of those that need it to really move the agenda forward?
Well, my learning is similar to Jackie's, really. One of the underpinning bits of infrastructure that supports Frimley is the Thames Valley and Surrey Local Health Record project, which actually goes across Oxford, Berkshire, Bucks and Surrey. And but it's the deployment of the intelligence and the data that comes through having a single healthcare record, but then the connectivity with our local authorities and primary care. That's enabled now the emerging liberation of access to that data to all partners in the system. So when our primary care colleagues get hold of it and can analyse their patient population, they're really into predicting where high usage will come from. And what's unlocked that is we've had endless debates around information governance, but really what unlocks that is clinical vision around safety and what's safe and doing the right thing for your population. You can cut through all the rules and regulations on IG if you can get really do that kind of common purpose thinking, particularly clinically led, and looking at real-time information about their patients and being able to see the patterns. It almost then determines well, what's blocking the completeness of the picture? It's an access to data, and that in a sense drives change and transformation, and then enables GP practices to sign up to shared information frameworks. And so whilst we kind of get a bit obsessed with saying if only we had the national guidance on IG, we've actually managed to lock it through a kind of clinical imperative discussion. So so going back to the points about courage, clarity of purpose, who are we all here for, and what's the benefit of creating a common data platform that's live for everyone to serve. And as long as you're holding on to those, that can remove the barriers.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm going to give the floor back to Chris to ask some more questions, but I think you've all really highlighted the importance of getting the data integrated and together to make the place a success. So Nick, hopefully they've answered your question.
So thanks, Hannah. Perhaps I can come back to Jackie. I'm intrigued listening to the conversation, what this all means for you as leaders. How, Jackie, as a chief exec of a very big foundation trust, you actually use your time on a day-to-day basis to play within the place and the partnership, as well as having the responsibility in your own organisation?
Thanks, Chris. I mean, I'm sure there's some commonality with other leaders on this call. The jobs that we've got now have changed radically. I've kind of been at it probably way too long, but you know, now a significant portion of my time is spent leaning over into other spaces and working out how we create what I call these sticky edges with enterprise, with, you know, innovation, with other partners, particularly in place. And I think it's leading me to think really, really differently. I mean, some of the development that we're doing internally now, in fact, we don't do much development without it being a place-based development program. So we've had several hundred of our clinicians and managers through a program that we're running with Newcastle Business School around, you know, collaboration. And I can't tell you the innovation that's come through just sitting different teams from different parts of the system together. But it really makes you think about, you know, the role of the executives and the role of the leaders. And it is so much more fluid by necessity these days. I'm now really thinking hard about what on earth does an executive team in an organisation, and what is the leadership capability needed in an organisation like mine? Because you look at our constitution as an FT, oh my God, it needs urgent refresh. So in short, Chris, I spend an awful lot of time, you know, 2/3 of my energy, time, space on sticky edges partnership work.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Donna, I can see you nodding in violent agreement there.
Yeah, totally agree. I do think we need to, it's almost as if our FTs have not caught up governance-wise, you know, not their fault, but we've got NEDs, you know, who are kind of contracted to come in. Somebody's asked what's the role of a NED in place, and I think that's a really great question. And what I'm trying to do with our NEDs, and they're pushing me as well, is to stop seeing us as an FT as being a hermetically sealed institution that could be anywhere. You know, looking at examining KPIs and risk registers and things like that. We've got to understand our communities better. We've got to think about the connection, particularly the connection to social care, thinking about the connection to reablement. You know, again, in Wigan, we tripled the size of our reablement team to keep as many people as possible out of hospital. That cost us money, but we were thinking system. And I think we've got to get our NEDs, all of our leaders, all of our execs thinking place, thinking system, understanding the communities that they serve.
Yeah. And Fiona, if I come to you next, I mean, how do we move beyond the kind of mentality of Fortress Foundation Trust to see Foundation Trust actually as being key partners within place and within systems?
Well, I mean, my organisation's the Foundation Trust and has been since 2008. And one of the drivers for us to absolutely see as our core function partnership as a driving fuel of the organisation was our clinical strategy. And our clinical strategy was deeply embedded in population health analysis and the role of mental health and well-being in human health. And so we framed our organisational purpose as being about serving our population and community to best effect. So whilst also trying to deliver the services we're directly responsible for in the best way possible, we do have, it is enshrined in FT language about being for public benefit. And so we took that to the nth degree, that therefore we had a role to partner really well with our acute partners in terms of developing liaison services ahead of it being told to nationally, but also with our local authority partners in place. And to see, as somebody's just said, the role of leaders in our organisation is to think system and place and partnership as opposed as a delivery vehicle for us, and be clear about the nature of the work that we do in health. Health work is a human service, but it is an intervention. It's a doing to service, whereas we're not best placed to then do the wider collaboration, but we can bring that expertise into the collaboration. So it's kind of, we work really hard as a foundation trust to make it part of our DNA, but it was through trying to have absolute clarity of clinical purpose and our role in wider society. And I think we can get there quite quickly.
So Joe, if I come to you, I mean, this is not a loaded question, but you know where it's coming from. So what's your experience as a GP leader in North Central London, where you've got some very big beasts in the NHS Foundation Trust world, and are they playing in place and system?
Fascinating question, Chris. Thank you. So I would say that, you know, I suppose I occupy this space as commissioner, and you obviously have to, you know, we all recognise the historical battles that we've had, the provider commissioner debate. But I would say that certainly in North Central London, the conversation has changed, the tone of the conversation has changed. And I think that that's, you know, I am hearing that that is also a national change. So the role of the commissioner is much more one of a facilitator, a convener of conversations. My role is very much to listen, because every part of my system certainly has its own problems, and these problems have often become, you know, have been brought to bear in fragmentation and people not coming together. So it really is important to listen and to hear what people are saying across the system, because they are valid. They are valid. So I think that, building on your point, Fiona, you know, the idea about building the clinical case for change, a successful moment for me was, you know, in my role as convening the clinical community in North Central London, was that the medical director of a very large trust did actually, and you could see the light bulb going on, was to say, you know, so our role as clinicians within our system is to ultimately be accountable to our population. That's what I want to see, that's what I want to do and to be. And for me, that was a fantastic statement, which I've played back again and again, because it is about creating that collective, that collectivism and that collective accountability to actually deliver to the population, not the organisation, not the practice, but for us to bring to bear our collective and managerial leadership to deliver to and be accountable to our residents. And so I think that it's once one begins to win the hearts and minds across the system, and we use multiple ways to do that. It's conversational, it's relational, it's bringing people together, mixing them up, presenting the data, hard stuff, soft stuff, that will eventually turn the ship in a different direction.
Thanks, Joe. And if I could just add a comment from my own experience before passing back to Hannah. So as a NED myself, there was a question about where NEDs contribute. I was asked by Dominic Dodd, the chair of Royal Free London Hospitals, to chair the Trust's Population Health Committee. I think it's relatively unusual for a large specialist foundation trust to have a population health committee. And one thing we're doing is particularly focusing on the 3 boroughs in North Central London that we serve. That's Camden, Barnet and Enfield, and building integrated care partnerships in each of those boroughs with the local authorities, with the voluntary and community sectors, as one stepping stone from looking beyond the 4 walls of our 3 hospitals into the wider community and drawing on all the assets. And particularly important in the context of COVID, because the health inequalities have become much more visible to all of us. The economic consequences, and our boroughs are very much focused on economic recovery. I think the example that Jackie, you gave of the new laboratory creating 3,000-4,000 jobs, I think you said, in your community, is a great example of how we can work in that partnership way. Anyway, enough from me. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you. In fact, I want to pick up from some of the things you were saying, Joe, and I want to ask specifically about the role of people with lived experience and how they need to play into some of the conversations you were describing as happening. I was talking to some colleagues yesterday who were reflecting on how through the pandemic, actually engagement and involvement of people with lived experience has gone to the sidelines somewhat because of issues of pace. And yet is so critical in the way that actually Donna was talking about in making place a success. And I just wanted you to bring in your experiences and reflections on the importance of engagement with people with lived experience.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that we've all been really very vocally criticised, and quite rightly, for the fact that the pace of change has meant that our ability to really fulfill the cycle of bringing the lived experience to bear in our delivery of services. And, you know, as we go into the next phase, it remains very complex, and we continue to be challenged on it, quite rightly. People are finding it very difficult to understand the construct of the pandemic and the emergency response and the meaning for how we deliver services. But to come back to your question, I think this should and could be done, and is done, in fact, at multiple levels. So I think that, you know, if you think about the construct of an integrated care system at that high strategic level, it will ever be important to continue to bring to the fore the lived experience into those conversations. I think that otherwise we are very much in danger of doing everything that we ever did, whereas actually, coming back to my previous point, we must be held accountable to our residents and to our population as a system. And many of our maybe many of our trusts or larger organisations may not actually necessarily be up against the coalface of some of that lived experience and what that really means. So I think that that's certainly an important challenge, and certainly the same person who provided me with the challenge around clinical accountability did actually say, well, within the construct of our health and care cabinet, we should actually bring to the fore that lived experience in our conversations, so that as we think about our clinical case for change, the redevelopment of our clinical strategy, that we're absolutely demonstrating that accountability, because we will hear things and we will be told things that we did not know and we could not imagine. So I think that's really important. I think the opportunity around the place-based partnerships is that actually you can bring to bear that sort of tactical commissioning, if you like, so as to be able to actually develop services in a very meaningful way to respond to the needs of smaller population sizes, taking into account the fact that different groupings have different needs, so to be far more person-centred and bespoke to communities. So I think that that work is still going on. Borough partnerships are still active. They're still doing the work. I think our evolution in governance terms around how the borough partnerships feed into the integrated systems and the role of strategic commissioner is still nascent, still needs to be worked on. We absolutely need to be asserting that lived experience in that whole cycle. But I think that so long as we hold on to that as a fundamental of good, as a northern star, then I think that that will be, that will be important in our development as we move forward towards March, actually, when effectively the integrated care system becomes a real entity on the map of the NHS and care landscape.
Thank you. Jackie, I'm wondering about your perspective on this. I mean, I guess my first question, do you think it's been harder to do it effectively over the past period? It'd be great to get your reflections from the role that you play in the system, and what do you think needs to be done to bring it more into the fore of the conversation in the system or in the place?
So it's been fascinating really over the last, we took the first COVID patient in February, in the first UK COVID patient. We'd no idea at that point what was going to happen next. In many, many ways, we've made more progress in the last 6 to 8 months on engaging with our populations, on thinking and aligning and being really purposeful in that true north pursuit of, particularly around, caring for more vulnerable communities. So I think what I've seen is we've accelerated it, and it's really interesting right now. I was having a discussion actually on a call with Simon Stevens and Amanda yesterday about, please don't start to put some of those lack of permission to talk to our communities, because I think Joe makes a really important point about populations at the moment are really scared, they're very confused, very concerned about what next. And I think that can only be handled at a place-based level. And generally, as you might expect, I'm the last person to go in front of the audience. You know, it's typically been our GPs, you know, our clinicians, our social workers, and so on. So I think, you know, the power of the narrative and really using this as an opportunity. There's a lot of conversations about reset, but I genuinely think we've created a different rhythm and we're not going to let anything disrupt that. I think it's really, really important we stay focused and keep pushing back when some of the bureaucracy starts to grasp and tie us up again and prevent us from really engaging with our communities.
Thank you. I want to keep on this thread and pick it up with Donna and Fiona. And there's a couple of questions in the chat. One is actually just a kind of reflection that we have quite a fabulous panel here, and there are other parts of the health and care system, the NHS, that aren't advanced as you are, and so thinking about spread and maybe spreading some of the best practice that Jackie was just talking to. So with that note, and picking up Steve's question in the chat, Donna, you know, in terms of spread, actually the NHS is still generally poor at involving people with lived experience. So I don't know if I should use the word generally, but it's definitely my experience that lots of places resist doing it, still find it difficult. Guess I'd interested to know what your advice would be to give them some confidence in doing it more. And I'm going to ask the same question to you, Fiona, as well, because I know your organisation does it really well. But Donna, what's your advice to start with?
Okay, I mean, apologies for my dog. Postman's here, so it's just bad timing, I'm afraid. Yeah, so I think it does annoy me a little bit when we talk about people with lived experience as if they are this odd group of people. We've all got lived experience, and for me it's not just about, you know, wheeling people out to the board and listening to a patient story and then doing absolutely nothing about it. For me it's about how all public servants, including NHS staff, work differently and form a kind of new social contracts, a different relationship with our residents and patients, you know, people, not just patients, and thinking about how we can work relationally across the system, rather than you know, trying to see people as a unit of need, you know, the appendix in bed 3, that kind of terminology that we tend to use, and, you know, trying to understand better how people live their lives, and until we do that, we won't be able to fix the system. We won't be able to cope with, you know, further waves of COVID-19. Or, I mean, not forgetting, we had a crisis before COVID struck, you know, a crisis of population health. People were dying sooner. For the first time in 40 odd years, that was starting to happen. So we need to do this anyway. We need to radically transform the relationship that we have with patients. You know, it needs to be about kind of rights and responsibilities, and that is much better done at place. That's what the deal was all about. It was a social contract between citizen and state. It saved a lot of money, but it also improved outcomes, and it proved that it can be done. This is going to be a long-term mission, not just a flash in the pan project.
Thank you. Fiona, any thoughts from you on this topic?
Oh, yeah, a lot, but I don't know whether I can be coherent and concise on this. So people will have heard me talk about the fact that I think that this is where we have to be really courageous as leaders, and also recognise that, you know, we all have families. We are human beings. We can be patients. We might need support from our local authority for. So and one of my biggest learning experiences, Chris has heard me talk about this, is when I had sepsis 2 years ago, and I became extremely ill, and then experienced critical care, intensive care, and mental health support, rehab support, social care support, going home. So I lived the system, the system saved my life. And so there's something about really thinking about, when is it right? For what purpose do we really need to work with people and include people. And I think certainly in crisis, people really like to be led on certain things and need confident expert leadership and support, especially if you're feeling very vulnerable and exposed. But then when it comes to really shaping and designing, then it's really important to understand what matters to people. And the NHS, if you think of it, the health construct, a bit like the book, is often derived, the nature of the work is about repairing. But when we're consulting and developing stuff, that expertise, our expertise, we can be incredibly paternalistic in our interactions with people, and it doesn't work. So there's something about using each other and being humble about who would be best to lead engagement and discourse, and being citizen-led or user-led on certain aspects. And so in the mental health world, we've probably done more than other health sectors on having user-led services, our recovery colleges, but it's worked in concert with understanding when best to really hand over the baton in terms of co-design and leadership, but also who else in terms of the voluntary sector are much better at really engaging and getting alongside lived experience with individuals. And it's kind of deploying, not trying to do everything in the same way for all tasks. It's kind of my summation of all of that. It's where I'm at.
Thank you. I think that's pretty fabulous advice for everyone. Chris, any final words from you? We need to let these people go on time.
Well, it's hard to add, isn't it, Hannah? I mean, I just wanted to underline, I think, the point that everybody's made in different ways, and Donna summarised it around the social contract between public services on the one hand and the people we are serving on the other hand. And recognising that, and recognising that there are rights and responsibilities on both sides, and we need to shift from the old-fashioned paternalistic model where those running services, both at the coalface and in the boardrooms, knew best, to a more humble approach, that humility that I know Donna and colleagues exhibited in Wigan, which I think has come through from all the contributions this morning. Having an open mind, listening to people, not telling people what needs to be done, and then acting on that, whether it's lived experience or anything else. So it's about a fundamentally different relationship, I think, between service providers and deliverers on the one hand and the people we're serving on the other hand. I think that's come through loud and clear throughout our discussion in the last hour. So thank you.
Thank you to Jo, Donna, Jackie and Fiona. It's been fabulous to spend the last hour with you in conversation. As I think some of the people were putting in the chat, really inspirational contributions from 4 powerful female leaders in the health and care system. It was great to get this time with you. And for everyone listening or watching, do join Chris and me again when we'll be talking about building resilient systems on Tuesday next week at 1 o'clock. So either pick up the recording of that one or come and join us live for a bit of a break from your normal day. And on that note, big thank you from me. See you soon.